Story number 1. The Silent Sea. The sea had always been a mystery. A vast, unforgiving expanse where time could stretch into infinity. But for the small crew aboard the Starlight Voyager, it was just another ship on another routine voyage. The old cargo ship creaked and groaned as it cut through the water, its engines humming steadily as the endless horizon greeted them every day. It had been years since anyone had cared to upgrade the vessel, and now it felt more like a relic of a forgotten era, silently carrying its burden through the water. Captain Hayes, a man whose face was as weathered as the ship itself, had seen his fair share of dull voyages, but something about this one was different. At first, it was subtle, the kind of thing that could easily be dismissed. A flicker at the edge of his vision, a shadow in the corner of the room, or a strange rustling sound when there was no wind. But over time, it grew harder to ignore. The crew, 4 men, all hardened sailors who had spent years at sea, began to notice it too. At night, when the ship seemed to be swallowed by the darkness of the ocean, an oppressive silence blanketed the deck. No birds called out in the distance. No waves crashed against the hull. It was as if the world itself had fallen into a deep slumber, and they were the only ones left awake. And then came the voices. It started with murmurs, low whispers that seemed to drift on the air, carried by the wind. But no matter how hard they listened, the words were indecipherable. At first, the men laughed it off as a trick of the mind, the stress of the journey playing games with them. But as the days dragged on, the whispers grew louder. They could no longer ignore the sensation of being watched, the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was always just out of sight. It was during one of the long, moonless nights that they first saw the figures. At first, they appeared only as shadows, shifting in the periphery of their vision. A flicker of movement just beyond the reach of the ship's dim lights. But soon, they became clearer. Dark, featureless shapes, hovering just at the edge of the ship's deck. There were no faces, no forms to identify them. Just shadowy, elongated figures that seemed to dissolve into the air when stared at too long. I saw them again, First Mate Roberts confessed one evening, his voice tremulous. On the port side, they were standing there, just watching. The others exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had dared to speak of it before, but now it was clear that whatever they were experiencing was no longer a mere figment of their imagination. Something was happening on the Starlight Voyager, something they could not explain. And then the time, if it was time, began to slip away. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days. The ship seemed to be moving, but the horizon remained unchanged. It was as if they were sailing in a circle, trapped in an endless loop, the sea stretching out in all directions without end. No matter how far they sailed, the same stretch of water met their eyes, the same dark expanse surrounding them like an impenetrable wall. "Have we passed this place before?" asked O'Connell, the ship's mechanic, as he stared at the water ahead. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. "It feels like we've been here forever." They couldn't say for sure. The days had no meaning anymore. Watches were missed. Hours disappeared. Meals were forgotten. They were all haunted by the growing sense that they were no longer in control of the ship, that it was somehow alive. Alive with a past that refused to be forgotten. The crew's fear escalated when they began to find strange markings on the walls of the cargo hold, faint scratches, as though something had been clawing at the wood from the inside. And the smells. At times, the air was thick with the stench of salt water and decay, a smell that no amount of cleaning could remove. Captain Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He'd stand on the bridge, staring out into the darkness, but it was no use. There was nothing but the endless black sea. Still, he couldn't help but feel it. The presence, the oppressive weight that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. And then, one night, it happened. The Starlight Voyager came to a sudden stop. The engine sputtered and fell silent. The crew scrambled to understand what had happened, but the machinery was fine. There was no reason for the ship to be still, not in the middle of the ocean, where there should have been nothing to impede their course. Then they heard it, the sound of the storm. It began with a faint rumble, a distant growl from beyond the horizon. But before they could react, it was upon them, crashing against the ship with the fury of an ancient god. The wind howled. Waves towered over the deck, crashing down with brutal force. Lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the Starlight Voyager as though it were a tiny insect caught in a spider's web. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. The ship had not moved an inch, but the world around it had changed. The water was still. The sky was a sickly green. And in the distance, far beyond where the eyes could see, they could make out figures. Hundreds of them floating in the water, their faces pale and featureless, their eyes vacant. The ghosts of the past passengers, victims of the storm, had returned to claim the ship. The Starlight Voyager was no longer just a ship. It was a prison, a vessel that carried the souls of those who had died within its walls, forever trapped in a cycle of torment. And as the crew stood frozen, their minds unraveling from the pressure, Captain Hayes understood one thing. The ship was never meant to sail again. It had already drowned long ago. They were all dead. The silent sea had claimed them, just as it had claimed the souls before them. And they would never escape. Story number 2. The Ghost of the Starboard Watch. Bill Hawthorne had retired from the sea over 10 years ago, but the ocean never truly let him go. Even after the accident, even after the tragedy that had taken the life of his best friend, Charlie, Bill had always felt the pull of the water. It was in his blood, in his bones. He couldn't escape it. So when the offer came to join a short voyage on the Cedar Queen, a passenger liner that Bill had sailed on during his younger years, he didn't think twice. It wasn't much of a trip, just a few days, and the captain had been an old friend. There would be no harm in it. The Cedar Queen was still the same ship Bill had sailed on all those years ago. Its grand hallways, the familiar creak of the decks, the endless blue stretching out to the horizon. Yet something about the ship felt off, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As Bill boarded the ship, a sudden chill ran through him. The sea was calm, and the sky was clear, but a heavy fog began to roll in as the ship set sail, wrapping the vessel in an eerie embrace. Bill stood on the deck, watching the fog swallow the ship. He tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach, the tightness in his chest. He knew what he was doing was foolish. He had sworn never to step foot on this ship again, not after that night. That night. The accident. The memory of it was still fresh in Bill's mind, as if it had only happened yesterday. The fog had been thick then too, suffocating the ship in its gray embrace. Bill had been on the starboard watch, and Charlie had been with him, just a few feet away, watching the waves crash against the hull. They had been friends for years, and that night, like so many others, had been one of routine. But then came the sound, a cry, a sharp, agonizing scream that echoed through the fog. Bill had turned just in time to see Charlie, slipping into the cold, unforgiving waters below. It had been his fault. He hadn't been fast enough. He hadn't reached out in time, and Charlie had drowned. No one ever blamed Bill, no one except for himself. The guilt, the grief, had eaten away at him for years. That was why he had left the sea. That was why he had promised never to return. But now, as the Cedar Queen sailed through the fog, he felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been here before, that the ship was leading him back to the place he had tried so hard to forget. It started quietly, just a whisper at the edge of his hearing, something faint and distant. At first, he thought it was the wind or the creak of the ship's timbers, but the voice came again, clearer this time, a voice he knew all too well. "Bill." He froze. It was Charlie's voice. It wasn't possible. Charlie had died all those years ago. He had heard the man's last breath, felt the empty silence when the rescue crew pulled him from the water. But the voice came again, more insistent now. "Bill." His heart raced. He turned, half expecting to see Charlie standing there, a ghostly figure in the mist. But there was nothing. Just the fog, thick and suffocating, swirling around the deck, his breath caught in his throat. The ship felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped in an instant. Against his better judgment, Bill moved toward the starboard side of the ship, where the voice seemed to be calling from. He had to be sure. He had to know if he was losing his mind, or if something else, something far darker, was at play. The ship's corridors were eerily silent as he made his way through them. The low hum of the engine was barely audible now, drowned out by the pounding of his own heart. He reached the starboard watch, the same place where the accident had happened. The air was thick with fog, and the deck was empty. Empty, except for the whispering voice, now much closer. Bill's breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped forward, his legs unsteady. He could feel it now, a presence in the air, a weight on his chest. He wasn't alone. "Charlie?" His voice cracked as he called out, but there was no answer. Just the fog and the endless whispering, growing louder with each step. The deck seemed to stretch before him, the distance between him and the sound growing longer and longer. Bill felt as if he were walking in a dream, as if the ship itself was shifting, warping. The walls of the ship seemed to close in on him, trapping him in a nightmare that he couldn't escape. And then he saw it. A shadow. A figure just beyond the reach of the fog, standing at the edge of the deck. Bill froze. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure turned toward him, its face obscured by the mist. The voice, now unmistakable, echoed through the fog. "Help me." It was Charlie. Or at least it sounded like Charlie. But there was something wrong. The figure's form wavered, flickering in and out of view, like a reflection on the surface of water. Bill stepped forward, his legs trembling. He reached out, but the moment his fingers brushed the cold air, the figure vanished. The ship seemed to exhale, a deep, guttural sound, as if the very vessel itself was alive. Bill stumbled back, his mind racing. The fog began to lift, but the ship was no longer the same. The deck was empty, the corridors silent. The weight in the air was gone, but the terror remained. He had returned to the place of his greatest regret, and the Cedar Queen had brought him here to relive it. The ship, haunted by the past, had called him back to the starboard watch to face his guilt, to face Charlie's ghost. And as Bill stood there, paralyzed with fear, he realized there was no escaping it. The ghost had always been there, waiting for him to return, and now he would never leave. Story number 3. The Unseen Passenger. The Aurora Horizon was the pinnacle of luxury on the seas, a gleaming cruise ship that promised nothing but indulgence and relaxation. Its sleek white hull cut through the ocean like a knife through silk, and the passengers aboard it, eager for the vacation of a lifetime, could hardly contain their excitement. The voyage had been carefully planned, a week-long escape to tropical shores. The sun was shining, the water calm, and for the first few days, everything was perfect. But something changed on the 4th day. It started with the first disappearance. Maggie, a woman in her late 20s, had been traveling alone. Her cabin was near the back of the ship, away from the bustle of the main decks. One evening, she was last seen walking toward her room after dinner, a glass of wine in hand, and then nothing. She never came out. Her door was unlocked when the staff checked in the morning, but Maggie was gone. Her personal items remained undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything had happened. It was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. The crew didn't know what to make of it. They thought perhaps she had gone ashore for some reason, though there was no record of her disembarking. They continued the cruise, assuming the worst had happened. A personal emergency, maybe. But a few days later, another passenger disappeared. This time, it was an elderly man named Arthur who had been in the lounge, enjoying the entertainment. When the evening show ended, he was seen walking toward his cabin. The next morning, no one had seen him since. His room was empty, but his luggage was still there. No one could explain it. The ship had been thoroughly checked, and there was no sign of any struggle, no indication of foul play. It was as if he had simply walked out of his life and into another world. As the days passed, more passengers disappeared, one after another. The crew was on edge. They tried to comfort the remaining passengers, telling them not to worry, that they were safe. But there was something different in the air now, a tension that couldn't be ignored. The Aurora Horizon was no longer just a luxury cruise. It had become a ship of uncertainty, of fear, and of whispers. At night, strange things began to happen. Crew members, on their rounds, started hearing footsteps in empty hallways. Soft, deliberate steps, as if someone were walking just ahead of them. But when they turned the corner, there was no one there. They'd hear whispers too, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere, drifting down empty corridors, through the air vents, echoing through the walls. The sound was chilling, like voices from the past, long forgotten, calling out in frustration. It wasn't long before the crew began to suspect something far more sinister than mere coincidence. A crew member named Lara, who had been working on the ship since it first set sail, said that she had noticed something odd when she checked the ship's old records. Files from before the Aurora Horizon was refurbished and relaunched. She found mention of an incident, an old tragedy from years ago. The details were vague, but it was enough to stir a deep unease in her. The ship had been involved in a deadly accident years before, during its early years of service. A massive storm had struck, and the ship had been stranded for days without communication. Many passengers had died, and the survivors spoke of strange occurrences, of feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, of hearing voices when no one was around, of seeing shadows in the corners of their eyes. There were rumors of a passenger who had gone mad during the storm and who had somehow disappeared, never found. No one knew for sure what had happened, but Lara had a sinking feeling that the Aurora Horizon wasn't just haunted by the memory of that event. It was carrying something far darker. As the ship sailed further into the open sea, the weather began to change. The calm waters turned choppy. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and the ship seemed to groan under the pressure of the storm. The wind howled, and the sea crashed against the hull with a force that rattled the windows. Yet, despite the growing intensity of the storm, the crew and passengers felt a strange stillness. It was as if the ship itself was alive, and it was pushing them deeper into the tempest. One night, the ship's captain, Charles Monroe, was standing on the bridge, staring into the chaos outside. He had never seen anything like it. The storm raged, and the ship seemed to be fighting it, struggling to stay afloat. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, standing on the starboard side of the deck, staring out at the water. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat. but there was something wrong about him. He was translucent, flickering like a bad television signal. Captain Monroe's heart raced. He turned quickly, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. He wasn't the only one who had seen it. That same night, several passengers reported hearing the voice of a man, soft and distant, calling out from the depths of the ship as though searching for something or someone. Some said they heard it in their cabins, others on the stairwells. The voice seemed to be following them, moving through the ship like a shadow. By the time the storm reached its peak, the ship's crew was convinced that they were not alone. They were being haunted by an unseen passenger, someone who had died years ago, but who had never left the ship. It was a spirit, vengeful and restless, determined to make its presence known. The ship had become its prison, and it would not let anyone leave. With the storm still raging outside, the remaining passengers huddled in their rooms, fearful of what might happen next. The crew could only try to maintain order, though they too were consumed by terror. They knew that the ship was no longer just a luxury liner. It had become a cursed vessel, drifting through the endless sea with a vengeful spirit on board, an unseen passenger that would never leave. As the Aurora horizon sailed deeper into the storm, it felt like the sea itself was closing in, swallowing them whole. And in the darkness, the whispers continued, faint, distant, but always there, reminding them that they were never alone. Story number 4. The Last Crossing. The Sapphire Dawn was a small fishing boat, no more than 20 feet long, with a weather-beaten hull and a crew of 3. Jack, the captain, Mark, the first mate, and Ben, the deckhand. It wasn't a ship meant for long voyages, but it had been reliable enough for the small trips they made along the coast. So, when the elderly man, Mr. Garrison, showed up at the docks one morning, asking for transport to a remote island off the coast, the crew didn't think twice. They had made similar trips before, ferrying tourists or delivery cargo, and this man, despite his age and frailty, seemed harmless enough. Mr. Garrison was an odd character. He spoke little, his voice a raspy whisper, but when he did speak, it was with a tone of quiet authority that commanded attention. He had insisted on making the journey alone, refusing to let the crew accompany him. "I've been to the island many times before," he said, his eyes clouded with memories. "I do not need company." The crew reluctantly agreed. After all, they were being paid well for the trip, and it wasn't their place to question the whims of a paying passenger. The journey started smoothly, with the sun hanging low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the calm sea. For the first few hours, Mr. Garrison sat quietly at the bow, staring out at the horizon, his thin hands folded in his lap. It was a serene scene, one that felt almost like a peaceful farewell. But as the day wore on, something strange began to happen. The fog came in slowly, a thick mist that seemed to rise from the sea itself. At first, it was a thin layer that barely obscured the horizon, but soon it thickened, closing in on the boat like a blanket. Jack squinted ahead, but he could barely see more than a few feet beyond the bow. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply, and a strange stillness settled over the water. No birds, no wind, just an unnatural silence. "We should turn back," Mark said, his voice tight with unease. "This doesn't feel right." Jack was about to agree when they all heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, coming from the fog. It sounded like voices calling out in the distance, carried on the wind. The crew froze, listening. The voices seemed to echo, overlapping, speaking in a language none of them understood. It was an eerie, haunting sound that sent a shiver down their spines. "What is that?" Ben asked, his voice shaky. Mr. Garrison, who had been silent throughout this, finally spoke. "Don't worry," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the mist ahead. "They're just the souls of those who never left. The island calls to them." The crew exchanged confused looks. "The island?" Jack asked, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" But Mr. Garrison didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, his frail form swaying with the motion of the boat, and moved toward the stern, muttering something under his breath. The crew looked at each other, more uneasy than ever. What had started as a routine job was quickly becoming something they weren't prepared for. The fog deepened, and with it, the temperature dropped further. The voices grew louder, more insistent, though they were still unintelligible. It felt as though the boat was drifting through a veil, a thin membrane between the living and the dead. Jack tried to focus on navigating, but it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog lifted. They found themselves on the edge of an island, its jagged cliffs rising from the ocean like the spires of a forgotten cathedral. The island was barren, its surface dark and rocky, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. "We're here," Mr. Garrison said, a satisfied smile creeping across his thin lips. Jack glanced at the island, a cold unease settling in his chest. "This is it." "There's no port, no dock." Mr. Garrison didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for them to bring the boat closer to the shore. As the boat neared the rocky shore, the crew saw something strange. No sign of life, no vegetation, no birds in the sky. Just barren rock and silence. They helped Mr. Garrison disembark, but as he stepped onto the island, something about him seemed to change. The frailty in his body seemed to vanish, replaced by a sudden, unsettling strength. His face hardened, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He turned back to the crew, his voice low and rasping. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said, his voice cold and distant. "But this is where I belong." Before they could ask what he meant, Mr. Garrison turned and began to walk toward the center of the island, his figure disappearing into the rocky landscape. The crew watched in stunned silence. "What the hell just happened?" Ben whispered. Jack shook his head, his mind racing. "We need to leave, now." But as they began to turn the boat around, they heard it again, the whispers. They were closer now, rising from the ground, from the very rocks beneath their feet. The voices were clearer this time, not just whispers but words, agonized cries, pleading for release. Jack's heart raced as he looked back toward the island, feeling a wave of dread wash over him. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the shore. Mr. Garrison, but he was no longer the frail old man they had brought here. His face twisted with anger, his eyes filled with a malevolent rage. And then, behind him, the shadows began to stir. The crew could see them now, shadows in the shape of people, drifting from the rocks, moving slowly toward the boat. Faces twisted in agony, eyes empty, their forms flickering like candles in the wind. "We can't leave," Mark whispered, his voice trembling with terror. "We're trapped." The boat rocked violently as the crew tried to row away, but it felt as though something was holding them back, as though the island itself was pulling them toward it. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, drowning out everything else. And then, through the chaos, Jack heard Mr. Garrison's voice, clear and cold. "Welcome to the island of lost souls," he said. "You will never leave." The boat was pulled back toward the shore, the crew helpless against the unseen force. As the island's dark secret enveloped them, they realized the truth. They were the latest souls to be trapped on the island, part of a never-ending cycle, destined never to escape. And the last crossing had become their final journey. Story number 5. The Beneath the Coral Queen was everything you could want in a luxury yacht. A sleek, modern vessel that offered every comfort. Its polished decks and spacious lounges were filled with the laughter and chatter of its passengers, each one eager to experience a week of relaxation on the open sea. The crew was attentive, the sun was bright, and the water was as calm as glass. For most aboard, it was a dream vacation, far from the worries of everyday life. But that dream began to fade on the 4th day of their voyage. The engine sputtered, then went silent. At first, no one was overly concerned. The Coral Queen had been equipped with a state-of-the-art engine system, and the crew reassured everyone that it was a minor malfunction, nothing to worry about. They threw out the anchor and waited for the backup systems to kick in, but hours passed with no response. The ship drifted aimlessly in the desolate expanse of the ocean, the nearest land miles away. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water, and the peaceful setting started to feel less idyllic. The isolation began to press in on them, and as the night wore on, a palpable unease spread through the passengers. Something wasn't right. By the time evening set in, the air had grown thick with an unnatural stillness. The hum of the ship's systems had stopped, leaving a quiet that felt almost oppressive. The once lively conversations had died down, replaced by nervous glances and low murmurs. The ship, which had once seemed so spacious, now felt cramped and confined. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them. Even the crew, usually so confident and capable, seemed on edge. The first incident happened just after midnight. Megan, a young woman who had been relaxing on the upper deck, vanished without a trace. One moment, she was chatting with her friend near the railing, and the next, she was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence that she had left the deck. The crew searched for hours, calling her name, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if the sea had swallowed her whole. The others tried to stay calm, convincing themselves that Megan had simply wandered off in a panic or had slipped into one of the lower decks. But deep down, everyone knew something wasn't right. The Coral Queen was no longer the luxury yacht it had been. It felt more like a prison. That night, the strange noises started. At first, it was faint, a light scratching sound coming from below deck, like something scraping against the hull. It was subtle, easy to ignore. But then, as the hours stretched on, the sounds grew louder, tapping, scratching. A low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the very heart of the ship. It wasn't the wind or the waves. This was something different, something unnatural. And it came from deep within the ship. The passengers, their nerves frayed, started to gather in small groups, talking in hushed tones. They had no idea what was happening. It was clear that the yacht was not just stranded. It was being affected by something. Something that was creeping into their minds, twisting their perceptions. Then, one by one, the passengers began to disappear. Tom and Sarah, a couple who had been enjoying the trip, were the next to vanish. They had been in their cabin talking about the strange events of the night when the noise from below deck seemed to intensify. The scratching, the tapping, and those terrible moans grew louder, as though something was trying to claw its way up from the depths of the ship. The couple tried to make sense of it, but by morning they were gone. The crew was no help. They had already been stretched thin by the mechanical failure and the disappearance of Megan. Now, they seemed as bewildered as the passengers, unsure of what was happening or how to stop it. As the hours dragged on, the tension among the remaining passengers became unbearable. Everyone stayed in groups, huddled together, eyes darting nervously toward the stairs leading below deck. No one wanted to go near the lower levels. It felt wrong, as though something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. And then, the unthinkable happened. Tom and Sarah reappeared, but they weren't the same. When they came back, they didn't remember where they had been. Their eyes were hollow, vacant, and they spoke in a strange, distant tone, as if they were speaking from far away. Something was different about them, something that couldn't be explained. The crew tried to talk to them, but it was clear they had been changed. As the night wore on, more passengers returned in the same state. Confused, their eyes glazed over, their minds twisted by something that had happened below deck. Each one of them had a story to tell, but none of it made sense. They spoke of long, dark corridors that led deeper into the ship than they had ever known. They described an overwhelming sense of dread, of something ancient and alive that lurked beneath the Coral Queen, its presence heavy and suffocating. The noises from below deck grew louder. The ship felt alive, as though it was responding to the passengers' fear, feeding off it, growing stronger with every passing hour. The walls seemed to shift and pulse, the sounds coming from the very heart of the vessel. It was as if the ship itself was alive, and it was hungry. The last of the passengers, those who had not disappeared or been driven mad by whatever had taken hold of the Coral Queen, gathered at the stern, their faces pale with terror. They tried to formulate a plan, but deep down they knew the truth. There was no escape. The ship had already claimed them. It was no longer just a luxury yacht stranded in the ocean. It was a tomb, and the thing that lived in its hold had no intention of letting them leave. As the ship drifted further into the oppressive darkness, the scratching and moaning from below reached a deafening crescendo. The yacht was no longer the Coral Queen. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for years, perhaps centuries, for the right moment to rise from the depths and claim its prize. And they were its prize. The Coral Queen had become a place of horror, a place where no one left, where the depths of the ship held something far older and more terrifying than any of them could comprehend. And as the last screams echoed through the empty halls, the ship sailed on, its belly full, its hunger never satisfied. Story number 6. The Phantom Captain. The Siren's call had been lost for over 70 years. A once proud merchant ship, it had gone down in the depths of the Atlantic during a violent mutiny, taking with it the lives of its crew and its captain. The wreck was buried under layers of sand and salt, untouched by time, until a team of marine archaeologists were given the rare opportunity to investigate it. The team was small, 4 divers, including Dr. Claire Harding, a marine archaeologist with a reputation for uncovering the deepest mysteries of the ocean floor. Along with her were Tom, a seasoned diver, Sarah, a research assistant, and Ian, a young but eager technician responsible for the equipment. They boarded a research vessel and set sail, their destination clear, the wreck of the Siren's Call, where history waited to be uncovered. The dive began like any other. The boat anchored over the marked location, and the team descended into the deep, their lights cutting through the dark water like beacons. The wreck loomed in the distance, a shadowy figure beneath the waves, its shape just visible through the gloom. The moment they approached the wreck, however, something felt off. Claire brushed it aside as nerves, but as they swam closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The water around the ship was colder than it should have been, and the usual sounds of the ocean, the distant calls of whales, the hum of the currents, were eerily absent. It was as if the sea itself had gone silent, holding its breath. They reached the wreck, and the team began their work, carefully examining the debris and taking samples. The ship was nearly intact, its hull still holding strong despite the years beneath the ocean. As Claire and Tom moved further into the wreck, Claire felt a sudden pressure on her chest, a weight she couldn't explain. It was as though the ship itself was alive, holding them within its bones. "Claire, over here!" Tom's voice crackled through the radio. He was a few meters away, his light shining on an old, rusted door. They carefully pried it open, revealing the captain's quarters, remarkably preserved despite the years. The room was still. A few dusty papers floated in the water, the remnants of a life long lost. But what caught Claire's attention was the large, weathered portrait on the wall. The captain, a stern-looking man with cold, piercing eyes, stared back at them. His expression was haunting, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. "That's Captain Samuel Drake," Claire murmured, her fingers tracing the frame. She felt a chill run down her spine as she looked into the eyes of the painting. It was just a portrait, yet it felt as if those eyes were following her. Tom looked over her shoulder. "He looks angry." Before Claire could respond, she felt a sudden coldness wash over her. It wasn't the cold of the deep sea, it was something else, something unnatural. And then the lights flickered. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and she was surrounded by darkness. A voice echoed through the water, low and guttural, as though coming from the very depths of the ship. "Leave." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, but there was no one there. The water around her rippled, but the team was still, motionless. What was that? Sarah's voice echoed through their radios, her voice tight with fear. I don't know," Claire responded, trying to steady her nerves. But the sense of dread was growing. The air around them felt thick, oppressive. "Let's just finish the job and get out of here," Ian suggested, his voice shaky. But as they continued their exploration of the wreck, things grew worse. The feeling of being watched intensified. Shadows flickered just out of sight, and the voice, the captain's voice, grew louder, stronger. "Leave now, or join me." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Tom, who was no longer by her side. Panic rose in her throat as she searched the dark corners of the wreck. Where had he gone? Her light swept over the hull of the ship, revealing something that made her blood run cold. Tom was there, but he wasn't moving. He was standing rigidly by the captain's quarters, his eyes wide and unblinking, his face frozen in a look of terror. "Tom!" Claire shouted, but he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Suddenly, she was pulled backward, as if by some unseen force. She turned to see Sarah and Ian struggling to keep their ground, their eyes filled with panic. "We need to leave," Sarah cried, her voice barely audible over the static of the radio. But it was too late. The ship had them now. The walls of the siren's call seemed to close in on them. The water grew darker, colder. The light from their torches flickered and then went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. The scratching sound started again, this time coming from every direction. It was as if the ship itself was alive, groaning, reaching for them. "Captain Drake," Claire whispered, though her voice trembled with fear. "He's still here. He never left." The voice returned, louder this time, filling her mind with a sense of inevitability. "You will join my crew. Forever." Claire tried to swim, but the current pulled her back toward the captain's quarters. She felt an overwhelming force, a presence in the ship, as though the captain's spirit had taken control of the wreck, trapping them in its hold. The last thing Claire remembered was a cold hand. No, not a hand, but something else, gripping her arm, pulling her into the dark. When the rescue team arrived a few days later, the wreck was quiet again, the ocean around it calm. The ship was still there, just as they had left it. But the team never found Claire, Tom, Sarah, or Ian. Their gear was all accounted for, floating aimlessly in the water. The siren's call was abandoned, its secrets locked away in the deep. But every now and then, divers reported hearing something strange when they passed over the wreck. Low voices, scratching at the hull, calling out from below. The captain's spirit still waits, forever trapped in the depths of his ship, searching for new souls to join his crew. And the wreck, once a symbol of human ambition, has become his eternal prison. And the divers, they never leave. Story number 7. The Lurking Fog. The Elysium Dream was a modern cruise ship, a gleaming, floating city with every luxury one could imagine. For most of the passengers, this was the vacation of a lifetime. The sun was high, the ocean calm, and the mood was light as the ship set sail from the bustling harbor, heading into the open sea for a 5-day journey. The promise of relaxation, fine dining, and entertainment aboard the state-of-the-art vessel hung in the air, and everyone seemed eager for the trip ahead. But as the ship moved farther from the coast, something began to change. At first, it was subtle, just a slight chill in the air, an odd heaviness in the atmosphere. The sun, which had been shining brightly, disappeared behind a thick, unyielding wall of fog. It came quickly, rolling over the ship like a thick blanket, swallowing up everything beyond the deck. Within minutes, the Elysium Dream was shrouded in complete white nothingness. Passengers, once out on the open decks, found themselves unable to see more than a few feet ahead of them. Captain Randall, a seasoned veteran of the seas, had seen fog before, but this was different. It wasn't the gentle mist that usually rolled in overnight. This fog was dense, unnatural, as though it were alive. It seemed to cling to the ship, almost suffocating it, wrapping the vessel in a clammy embrace. Just a natural occurrence, he assured his crew, though there was a hint of unease in his voice. We'll be through it soon enough. Just stay on course. But as the hours passed, the fog didn't lift. It only thickened. Strange things began happening. At first, it was little more than a trick of the eyes. Passengers on the upper decks began reporting figures moving in the fog, shapes that seemed to linger just beyond their line of sight. Some claimed they saw shadowy figures standing near the edge of the deck, gazing out into the mist. But when they approached, no one was there. "Did you see that?" whispered Anna, a young woman in her 20s, to her friend Laura. They were sitting near the pool, staring out into the fog when they thought they saw a figure. A man, dressed in old-fashioned sailor clothes, standing on the edge of the ship. Laura blinked. "No one's there. You're imagining things." But Anna wasn't sure. She could still feel the presence, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the usual thrill of a mysterious sight. This felt wrong, as though something from the fog was trying to reach out, trying to make itself known. As the days passed, more passengers came forward with similar stories. Some heard whispers, faint voices that carried on the wind, too soft to understand but enough to send chills down the spine. Others spoke of hearing footsteps behind them in the empty hallways, the echo of shoes on the wooden floors. But when they turned to look, no one was there. The crew was growing increasingly nervous. Captain Randall, though outwardly calm, had his suspicions. He had studied the records of past maritime disasters, and the more he thought about the fog, the more uneasy he became. He'd heard the old stories about ships that had disappeared into dense fogs, never to be seen again. Legends told of vessels caught in a supernatural storm, trapped between worlds, unable to escape. Could the Elysium Dream be caught in one of those storms? Was it possible that this fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon? At night, the atmosphere grew heavier. The usual sounds of the ship, clanking metal, the hum of the engines, the distant chatter of passengers, seemed to vanish, swallowed by the thick mist. The only sound was the steady lapping of the waves against the hull and the occasional creak of the ship's timbers. But beneath the surface of calm, something was wrong. The passengers began to feel it too. The fog was no longer just a nuisance. It had become oppressive, like a presence that was closing in around them. Many of them found themselves unable to sleep, tossing and turning in their cabins as the fog pressed against the windows, dark and suffocating. Then, on the fourth night, a passenger named Henry Caldwell disappeared. He had been a quiet man, an older gentleman who kept to himself, but he was well liked by those who had spoken with him. He was last seen near the dining room, wandering out toward the deck for some fresh air. The crew immediately launched a search, but there was no sign of him. His cabin was untouched, and he hadn't returned to his room. The fog had become so thick they couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them. Hours passed with no word, and panic began to set in. If Henry had fallen overboard, it would be impossible to find him in the fog. But there was something else, an unsettling feeling that something more was at play. It wasn't just the missing man, it was the fog itself, closing in, thickening, wrapping around the ship. The next day, another passenger, Claire Sutton, went missing. The crew was frantic now. The ship's radio was down, and the fog had become so dense they couldn't see beyond the deck. They tried sending small search parties, but no one ever seemed to find their way back. The passengers' once carefree mood had shifted to fear and confusion. Many of them were huddled together in the lounges, whispering about the strange happenings. That night, the fog seemed to grow even thicker, pressing in on every side. Passengers could hear the sound of something dragging along the floor below deck. Slow, heavy steps, echoing through the halls, followed by whispers just out of reach. It was no longer just figures in the mist. It was something active, something that seemed to be walking the ship, searching for something. Captain Randall stood on the bridge, staring into the mist, as a cold shiver ran down his spine. He had seen this before, heard the old legends about the fog that trapped ships, about the souls of the dead who could never leave. He had dismissed the stories as nothing more than ghost tales, but now, in the heart of that suffocating fog, he wasn't so sure. And as the days stretched on, he began to wonder, was the Elysium dream lost, caught in a storm beyond their control, or was something more sinister at work? Had the ship wandered into the very fog that had claimed so many others before it? The fog pressed in closer, thickening, suffocating, until it felt like the ship was no longer floating on the sea, but trapped between worlds, lost in the endless mist, with no escape. And as the Elysium dream drifted further into the fog, the passengers and crew began to realize the truth. The ship was not just haunted by the dead, it was becoming one of them. The fog was alive, and it had no intention of letting them go. Story number 8. The Cursed Cargo. The Arctic Queen was a workhorse of a cargo ship, built to carry the heaviest and most valuable loads across the world's most dangerous seas. It was a ship with a reputation, fast, reliable, and able to handle the treacherous waters where other vessels dared not sail. But this voyage, its latest journey, would prove to be unlike any other. Captain Raymond Pierce had commanded the Arctic Queen for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. Storms that seemed to come out of nowhere, equipment failures that should have sunk the ship, and days when the sea seemed to be alive, playing tricks with the crew. But none of that had prepared him for this. The ship was carrying a special cargo, a single crate, about the size of a large refrigerator. The crate was tightly sealed with metal bands, and the crew was instructed never to open it. It had been loaded onto the ship at a private dock, with no information about its contents, just a vague order to deliver it to a remote port on the other side of the ocean. The instructions had come from a private client, a wealthy businessman with powerful connections. The captain was told only that the crate was of the utmost importance, and its contents were too valuable and too dangerous to be revealed. As the Arctic Queen sailed further from port and into the cold, dark expanse of the sea, the first signs of trouble began to surface. It started small. The engine sputtered for a moment, just long enough for the crew to notice, but not long enough to cause any serious alarm. Then came the strange noises, whispers in the hallways at night, clattering sounds from below deck, like someone was moving about in the cargo hold. The crew chalked it up to the usual creaks and groans of the ship, but there was something about the noises that unsettled them. It wasn't the usual sounds of a ship at sea. This felt different, like the ship itself was groaning under some heavy weight. The first accident occurred 2 days into the journey. First, mate Ben Hardy had been inspecting the cargo hold when a large crate, not the mysterious one, fell from its place and nearly crushed him. It didn't make sense. There had been no one around, no sudden shift in the cargo, but somehow the crate had come loose. Ben had been shaken, but he brushed it off as an accident. However, the crew began to notice that these small mishaps were becoming more frequent. Equipment started failing. Communication systems, the engine. Even the lights flickered intermittently as though the ship was struggling to stay afloat, as if it were fighting against something. By the third night, the tension was palpable. The crew couldn't sleep. Some of the men swore they saw shadows moving in the fog, silhouettes that seemed to appear and disappear too quickly to be real. The whispers from below deck grew louder, and now they were accompanied by faint scratching sounds, like something was clawing at the walls of the ship. The captain was becoming frustrated, trying to keep his men calm, but he couldn't deny that something was wrong. There was an unease in the air, a heaviness that seemed to grow with every passing hour. One night, just before midnight, the ship was rocked by a violent jolt. The crew rushed to the bridge, but Captain Pierce saw nothing in the water, no signs of impact. His first instinct was that the ship had struck something beneath the surface, but when the crew checked, the hull was intact. No damage, no reason for the violent shake. The next morning, Ben Hardy came to the captain with troubling news. The crate, the mysterious one, had moved. "I swear to God, Captain," Ben said, his voice hoarse with fear. "I saw it last night. The crate, it wasn't where it was supposed to be." The captain's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "It was a few inches to the left. Not much, but enough that it shouldn't have happened." Captain Pierce knew that no one had gone near the crate. The crew had been instructed not to touch it, not even to look at it, and it had remained untouched since the moment it was loaded onto the ship. But something was shifting. Something was waking up. The strange occurrences grew more frequent. The crew began to panic, their fear spreading like wildfire. They started to whisper among themselves, talking about the stories they'd heard, the old legends of ships that carried cursed cargo, of sailors who had vanished without a trace, of ancient entities bound in crates and boxes. The ship's log became filled with reports of things that couldn't be explained, sailors who couldn't sleep, who claimed to see figures standing at the edge of their vision, staring at them from the fog. Then came the disappearances. First, it was the cook. He had been found in the galley, his body twisted and contorted, as though something had crushed the life out of him from the inside. The crew searched for an explanation, but there was nothing. No signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. Just the body, cold and lifeless, staring out with wide, vacant eyes. Then, the second disappearance. The ship's engineer. He had gone down to the engine room in the middle of the night and never returned. The crew searched the engine room, but it was empty. No sign of him, just the faint smell of something rotten in the air. Captain Pierce began to wonder if the crate wasn't just cursed. It was as if the ship itself was becoming infected, poisoned by whatever was locked inside that wooden box. By the 5th day, the crew's paranoia had reached its peak. They no longer trusted each other. They moved in groups, eyes darting to every shadow, convinced that something was following them. The whispers grew louder, and the ship itself seemed to be alive, groaning and shifting, as if it were trying to throw them overboard. The engine failed again, and this time it took hours to fix. The temperature dropped, and frost began to form on the decks, despite the fact that they were still hundreds of miles from the nearest land. Captain Pierce finally made the decision. He ordered the crate be opened. It was the only way to end the madness, to finally see what had been causing all of this. When the crate was opened, it wasn't what they expected. There was no treasure, no rare artifact, no precious goods. Inside the crate was a book, a heavy, ancient-looking tome with pages that were yellowed with age. The book seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though it were alive. As the crew stared at it, the fog outside thickened, swirling around the ship like a living thing. The whispers turned into a low growl, the scratching noises now a full-throated scream. Captain Pierce was the first to open the book. The moment he did, the ship seemed to scream with him. The deck buckled beneath their feet. The lights flickered and died. The ship groaned, as though it were being torn apart by an invisible force. And as the ancient entity trapped within the book stirred, the Arctic Queen became something else. Something cursed. It was no longer a ship. It was a vessel of the dead, a place where souls were bound, forever trapped, just as the entity had been bound in the crate. The crew would never escape, and the Arctic Queen would never sail again. Story number 9. The Holodecks. The Orion Queen had once been a ship of prestige, a luxurious vessel that sailed through the waters, carrying the wealthy to exotic destinations. But those days were long gone. Now, the ship was an aging relic, its once polished decks worn and scratched, its once glamorous interiors faded and stale. The passengers it carried were few, and the crew, worn from years of maintaining a ship that seemed to be on its last legs, moved with the slow resignation of those who had seen better days. For Thomas Cole, the decision to board the Orion Queen was born out of necessity. He had just lost his wife, and the grief was a weight he could barely carry. The thought of returning to his small, empty apartment was unbearable. So, he decided to take a trip, anywhere, on a ship that had once been known for its elegance. The Orion Queen's final voyage was to be a quiet journey through the deep waters of the North Atlantic, heading toward a port that few now frequented. It seemed like the perfect place for him to find some peace. He boarded the ship in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the sky was heavy with clouds. The crew greeted him with polite, tired smiles as they showed him to his cabin. The room was small, the bed creaky, but it was all he needed. He had no interest in the lavish meals or the once popular entertainment. He only wanted silence and solitude. As the ship set sail that evening, Thomas stood on the deck, looking out at the water. The sea was calm, the air thick with the smell of salt and something older, something forgotten. He leaned on the railing, feeling the soft sway of the ship, and for the first time in days he felt his mind quiet a little. The weight of his grief seemed a little lighter, the vastness of the ocean giving him the space he needed to breathe. But that peace was short-lived. As the night wore on, the ship began to feel different. The air grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. Thomas made his way below deck to find something to eat, but as he moved through the narrow hallways, he began to feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. It was an odd sensation, something he couldn't quite place, but something that felt wrong. He passed a few crew members along the way, their faces blank and tired, but there was an emptiness in their eyes that unsettled him. The dining hall was nearly empty, with only a few passengers sitting at the tables, all of them eerily quiet. He ate quickly, not because he was hungry, but because the strange sense of unease was starting to gnaw at him. As he made his way back to his cabin, he heard it for the first time, a faint whisper, just at the edge of his hearing. It came from somewhere below deck, a soft murmur that seemed to drift up through the floorboards. Thomas stopped, straining to hear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The next night, the whispers returned. At first, Thomas thought he might be imagining it. After all, the ship was old, and the creaks and groans of the floorboards and walls were to be expected. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were not random sounds. They seemed to form words, though he couldn't make them out. There were murmurs, like a conversation taking place just below the surface, but when he tried to follow the sound, it would fade and shift to another part of the ship. Curiosity got the better of him. He decided to explore, hoping to find the source of the noise. As he walked the narrow halls, the shadows seemed to deepen around him, and the air grew colder. The ship felt larger in the dark, as if its winding corridors stretched endlessly, each hallway leading to another and another. He passed more empty cabins, their doors creaking open and shut as though caught by a draft. But there was no breeze. The whispers, though faint, grew stronger, and he followed them down into the bowels of the ship to the lower decks, where few passengers dared to go. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the ship itself was alive, breathing, moving beneath his feet. He reached the lower deck, a dark and damp place, where the air smelled musty and stale. The whispers were now a low hum, echoing off the walls. He turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, a man, dressed in an old-fashioned naval uniform. The figure was staring at him, unmoving, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through him. The man's face was pale, ghostly, and as Thomas stepped forward, the figure began to fade, melting into the shadows, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. Thomas took a step back, his heart racing. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. A faint sound, like the soft shuffle of footsteps, followed him down the hall. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder now, almost urgent, like a crowd of people calling to him. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, as if the ship itself were closing in, trapping him. And then, in the distance, he heard it. A woman's voice, soft and pleading. "Join us." Thomas froze, the blood draining from his face. The voice was coming from everywhere now, filling the dark hallways. He ran, not knowing where he was going, only that he needed to get out. He stumbled back up to the upper decks, gasping for breath. But when he reached the top, the ship seemed to stretch on endlessly. The corridors twisted, turning back on themselves. No matter which way he ran, he was always led back to the same place. It was then that he realized the ship was not just old, it was cursed. The souls of those lost to the sea, passengers who had never reached their destinations, were trapped aboard, doomed to repeat their final moments over and over again. The Orion Queen had become a ship of the dead, its hollow decks echoing with the voices of those who had perished, forever seeking new souls to join them on their eternal journey. As the ship drifted deeper into the night, Thomas could feel the cold hands of the past reaching out, pulling him into the shadows. He had come aboard seeking peace, but the Orion Queen had no place for peace. It had only room for the lost. And as the whispers filled his ears, he realized with chilling clarity he would never leave. Story number 10. The Captain's Burden. Captain. Marcus Byrne had spent nearly 30 years at sea, commanding ships of all sizes. He knew the rhythm of the waves, the creak of the hull, and the steady hum of the engine like the back of his hand. There was nothing that could rattle him, not storms, not pirates, not even the whispers of old sailors about ships haunted by things unseen. But the voyage he was on now would be unlike any other. The Sable Mariner was a sturdy, reliable vessel, built for long voyages across unknown waters. It was meant to be a routine journey, picking up cargo from one port and delivering it to another, with no surprises. Byrne had sailed this same route many times before, and he had every reason to believe this trip would be as uneventful as the rest. But as they sailed farther from familiar shores, things began to change. It started with the lights. At first, it was a simple flicker. One or two lights on the main deck would go dim, then return to normal. The crew barely noticed. Then, as the days passed, the flickering spread. The lights in the crew quarters, the navigation room, even the captain's own quarters. The dimming wasn't just a malfunction, it was unnerving, like something was deliberately trying to cut them off from the outside world, piece by piece. By the third night, the crew began to sense it too, a creeping unease that seemed to grow with each passing hour. Conversations that once flowed easily fell silent. Men looked over their shoulders, and their eyes darted nervously to the shadows. There was an oppressive weight in the air, as if something was watching them from the darkness just beyond the reach of the ship's light. Then, the clocks began to act strangely. It was a small thing at first, an hour lost here or there, but soon, entire hours slipped by without anyone noticing. They would wake up in the morning, only to realize the sun was setting much earlier than expected, or that they had missed a meal entirely. Time seemed to twist, like a knot in a piece of string being pulled tighter and tighter. Captain Byrne tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just the strain of being at sea, the pressure of navigating unfamiliar waters. But even he couldn't deny the growing tension. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing sense that something wasn't right, that something ancient and sinister was pushing against the ship, against him, and against the crew. One evening, while standing on the bridge, Byrne finally spoke to his first mate, Richard Hale, about his concerns. "This ship," Byrne began, his voice low. "There's something wrong with it, Richard. I can feel it. Something's out there, and it's pulling us into deeper waters." Hale looked out across the dark ocean, his eyes narrowing. "We're far beyond charted waters now, Captain. I've heard stories about ships that sail into places where no one's meant to go." Byrne's heart sank. He had heard those stories too. The old sailors' tales about ships that vanished without a trace, about crews that went mad or simply disappeared, their ships left adrift in cursed seas. He had always dismissed them as superstitions, but now, standing there on the bridge, the weight of those stories began to press down on him. That night, the ship's strange phenomena escalated. The temperature dropped, the air turning cold and damp as if they had sailed into a fog. Yet the sky above remained clear, a cold, uncaring black. As the crew moved about doing their duties, strange sounds began to echo from below deck. Footsteps that weren't there, dragging sounds that seemed to follow them, and the soft murmur of voices just at the edge of hearing. But when anyone tried to investigate, they found nothing. Captain Byrne's mind raced. He'd seen ships before that had been cursed, marked by forces beyond their understanding. The sea could be a vengeful, unknowable place, and he suspected the Sable Mariner had drifted into the heart of something that had been waiting for them. The curse wasn't just on the ship, it was on him too, on all of them. He could feel it pulling at him just beneath the surface. Something ancient that had been set in motion long ago. Then came the nightmares. Byrne would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, the shadows of the ship's corridors pressing in on him. He would hear a voice, low and distant, calling his name. It was the voice of someone he knew, someone from his past. A voice that had no right to be there. The voice would whisper of sins he had long buried, sins from his younger days, mistakes he had made, lives he had destroyed. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a reckoning. The ship, it seemed, was holding him accountable for something he had done long ago. By the 5th day, Byrne could no longer ignore the truth. The curse was real. It had been placed on the Sable Mariner, and it was tied to him and his crew. The ship was being dragged into an endless cycle of torment, its course set on a collision with fate unless something was done. Desperation drove Byrne to confront the one thing that had been gnawing at him, his past. He realized what the ship was demanding, a sacrifice. The sins of his past had to be confronted, faced head-on, and atoned for. But the cost of atonement would be steep. The crew could no longer hold it together. As the ship sailed further into the black, madness began to take hold. The voices grew louder, the whispers now full of rage and desperation. The ship seemed to groan and shudder under the pressure of whatever had been awakened. The men began to lash out, some retreating into madness, others turning on each other in fear. Byrne knew that in order to break the curse, to stop the ship from sinking into eternal darkness, he would have to make a horrifying choice. He would have to offer himself, a final, terrible sacrifice. As the Sable Mariner drifted toward the abyss, its crew members slowly disappearing into the void, Captain Byrne stood at the helm, his face pale and resolute. With a final breath, he steered the ship toward the heart of the storm that had followed them. The curse would be broken, but it would cost him everything. The Sable Mariner would never sail again, and neither would its captain. The ship would be lost to the sea, its haunting presence sinking into the depths, leaving only the echoes of its final voyage.